This morning, Ukrainian media reported that a shell had hit a school in the east of the country, wounding 2 teachers. Sporadic firing is normal along this line of control, but these are not normal times. There are reports today of shelling by the Ukrainians also, framed by the Russian side as an escalation by the Kyiv government.
Обстановка на линии боевого соприкосновения резко обострилась. Противник предпринимает попытки к развязыванию активных боевых действий. Украинская сторона продолжает нарушать взятые на себя обязательства по соблюдению режима прекращения огня. С начала текущих суток украинские боевики 4 раза нарушили режим прекращения огня.
Inevitably, perhaps with Vladimir Putin talking about genocide, Ukrainians feel the Russians are constructing a case for military escalation.
It's intentional, and it's about provoking our guys there, our military forces, and try to create a sort of spiral of events to test the nerves and to create another spin of military escalation.
The information battle is a regular part of life here, but some of the government's actions, for example, the recent banning of 3 Russian-language TV stations, have drawn criticism, in that case from the EU. Right now, with the threat of invasion, the Ukrainian authorities argue that keeping control of the message is a matter of life and death. They also argue that banning Russian-language media outlets has helped to make that population less susceptible to the Kremlin line.
I would say that because of banning TV stations, also this support goes down. Because actually the banning is not only now happening. Starting from 2016, we started this policy, and that was like a much highly criticized by Western countries in that period. But now many of them also like banned Russia Today or some other proxy media, because this is even not the media itself in the classical mood.
In projecting his own message, President Zelensky has toured the country, assuring troops and residents that they stand ready to meet whatever the Russian military might have in store.
Нас не лякають жодні прогнози. Нас не лякають жодні люди, жодні вороги. Нас не лякають будь-які дати, бо ми будемо себе захищати.
Increasingly, though, Ukrainian experts believe it's inevitable that violence will increase, with their country as a casualty of a Russian attempt to reset international relations.
It's about 2 things. One is to establish new geopolitics, actually to adjust current rules, the Second World War, to the current geopolitics, how Putin sees it. And it means spheres of influence. And the second point is Ukraine. The whole mere existence of Ukraine, not just the success story, a mere existence of Ukraine is a fundamental blow to the Russian system, how Putin believes he created it.
We have seen no evidence that Russian forces are withdrawing from Ukrainian border regions.
Tonight, the UK Ministry of Defence played its own card in the information war, releasing a video intelligence assessment that showed possible Russian axes of advance into Ukraine.
An invasion could happen within days.
In Kyiv, at the convergence of 3 of those arrows, all is quiet for now. Even if nothing on that scale happens in the coming days, people here do expect some kind of escalation, with a high chance that a further rhetorical flourish could pave the way for a military offensive. Now, the Americans had briefed that the Russian offensive would be ready yesterday. Then today, President Biden said within several days. His Secretary of State used the phrase, the coming days. Well, earlier we got through to the US ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, and I asked her whether putting a date on a possible invasion wasn't simply counterproductive.
The reason that Secretary Blinken felt compelled to go to the UN today, and the reason we also had Secretary Austin, our Secretary of Defense, here in Brussels, was that we wanted to talk to our allies, but also to message the world that we believe that Russia has done everything necessary to put things in place for an attack that could be within days. And that was a message that both the president wanted to get out and members of his cabinet wanted to get out today. We've seen some very troubling claims by the Russians over the last couple of days, some interesting claims that are entirely false about attacks that could or could not be using chemical weapons, some claims of terrorist attacks, mass graves. All of that points in our view to a Russian invasion in the coming days. We can't say with any certainty what that moment will be, when it will come definitively. But again, what we're doing is we're taking the best information that we have and really to warn the world that we believe that Russia is preparing to go into Ukraine. And so that was the message today.
Now, there's been this back and forth diplomatically between NATO and Russia. A Russian reply to the previous NATO one received in recent hours saying that NATO's responses are inadequate from the Russian point of view and they are now going to take these military technical measures. Do you know what they mean by that?
I don't think we fully understand what they mean, but basically what we've had in recent weeks is an exchange of letters. We've had first the Russians some weeks ago delivering the treaties. US and NATO responded with their own set of letters. We've now had an official Russian response come back. We'll have to look at that in great detail. It just landed in everybody's inbox. But essentially, what they're saying is that the response that came back from the United States and NATO is inadequate. But in my mind, what we collectively put on the table is an offer for dialogue along three main tracks. We're willing to sit down at any time and talk about arms control. We're willing to sit down at any time and talk about transparency measures where we could improve those measures. And we're also willing to sit down and talk about risk reduction. It appears that the Russians are not interested in sitting down with us. Secretary Blinken made the offer to sit down as early as next week with Russia. We'll see if they take him up on that offer.
You're a diplomat. What do you think of the language in these Russian communications? They were originally described by the Russians as demands, and then today we see this word inadequate. What do you make of that language?
Well, my interpretation of what came over from Moscow to begin with was really a set of what I would describe as maximalist demands. So they put a lot on the table that I think they understood were essentially non-starters. So for example, one of their big demands is that NATO eliminate NATO enlargement, its open door policy. What NATO did right out of the gates was to respond back to say, it would not be willing to discuss NATO's open door policy, and Russia would not be given a veto.
Do you think it's designed to fail?
Well, one has to ask, is Russia setting out these maximalist demands simply as a pretext? We do not know that. Or do they genuinely believe that the NATO alliance was prepared to shut the door on NATO enlargement, on the open door policy? I think they understood that NATO would not be willing to negotiate on that point. And the hope is that they will pivot away from that and focus on the areas where we believe real work can get done.
We've seen this step to potentially recognize the independence of the breakaway republics in the east of Ukraine. Now, if the President Putin, signs that into law, does that destroy the peace process, the so-called Minsk agreements?
If President Putin moves forward and signs the bill that recognizes the people's republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, essentially that is a stark violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and its sovereignty. And what it does, it essentially eliminates the Minsk agreement. So those two things would be deeply troubling, not only to the United States, but to the West more broadly. And I think at that point, then we're in a very different set of circumstances.
And lastly, if that happens and we witness a much larger use of force in the coming days, do you think there is any way that this can be resolved other than by a resumption of some kind of process where the Ukrainian government and the citizens of its eastern provinces make peace?
Well, right now we're pursuing these two tracks. On the one hand, we're trying to get Russia back to the table. We want them to choose the path of de-escalation. We've seen no signs of that, but we're hoping that they choose that path. If they do not, I can say, as the NATO ambassador, NATO is prepared for every contingency, and we will pursue both dialogue and de-escalation, but we will continue to look at deterrence measures as well.
Ambassador Smith, thank you very much. Now, the Americans have also been talking about various types of provocations or invented incidents that the Russians might use to trigger conflict. We'll see in the coming days whether they were right. Kirsty.